Welcome to the Owl Hoot podcast with me, Caroline Norbury. This is a show for any person interested in the environment and sustainability. I arrived at a point in my own life where I wanted to know more about the state of our planet and how I can play my part, albeit small, in mitigating climate change, reducing pollution and supporting biodiversity. I decided that chatting to others who are already doing something might be a good place to start. So each episode will feature a different guest telling their stories in and around an environmental activity that will perhaps provide you with ideas that you can incorporate into your own life. Enjoy listening and let me know if you have a topic you'd like to hear more about on the podcast, and I'll do my best to address it. Joining me today is Melissa Bruntlett, who alongside her husband Chris founded Modacity. They work with organisations communicating the benefits of sustainable multimodal transport to inspire happier and healthier cities. Together, they have authored 2 books, Building the Cycling City, the Dutch Blueprint for Urban Vitality, and Curbing Traffic, the Human Case for Fewer Cars in Our Lives. Canadian, but now living in Delft in the Netherlands, Melissa also works for a mobility consultancy, promoting the knowledge, policy and design principles gained in the Netherlands to other countries across Europe and North America. I'm excited to hear some of the ideas that can transform the structure of transport in cities, so it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Melissa to the podcast. Hello.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
No, I'm looking forward to it. So, I've not long finished your book, so I'm really excited to talk about that. But before we get into it, can you just give us a bit of a run through of, you weren't always in transport. How did that become a thing for you? And I'm sure at some point through that story, you're going to mention the fact that you now live in the Netherlands and you didn't always live in the Netherlands. So I'm over to you, Melissa, to give me a bit of background.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. I originally, when I was in high school, decided I wanted to become a fashion designer. And so that was the career path I followed through university. And for the first 7 years or so, post-graduating with a bachelor's degree in specializing in fashion design. And that took me, I was living in Toronto, Ontario at the time. Took me sort of into a few jobs here and there, and then eventually an opportunity for my husband Chris came up to move us to Vancouver. So just like me, he was also working not in transport. He studied architecture, and he came to Vancouver. We all came to Vancouver to work for an architectural firm there. And within a short period of time after moving there, we started to see a lot of the transformations happening in the city to make cycling much more comfortable for people to choose as a transport option. So when the opportunity came, we were both working within a 20-minute bike ride of our work. We decided to give up our family car and live car light, because there were a lot of car share options in Vancouver at the time, and give cycling a try. And it was through that experience and through experiencing what it was like to travel with 2 small children by bicycle and the various adapted ways that we can do that, that I found myself falling into an advocacy role in the city of Vancouver to help communicate to peers how it was possible that I could travel around a big city like Vancouver with 800,000 people, with a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old at the time, how it was easy, the benefits that I was experiencing in terms of greater connection with my kids, greater connection with the city, better experiences within the city in terms of being much more in touch with the natural and built environment. And then that sort of just ballooned over time. So Chris and I both sort of found ourselves as inadvertent advocates for cycling, not our intention, and that just telling people what it was that was so beneficial about cities that prioritize walking and cycling, not just for me, but for my kids and for all the other people within cities. And that journey took us to starting Modacity, as you mentioned in the opening, which eventually gave us the opportunity to travel here to the Netherlands in 2016 for 5 weeks. And the intention was to write 5 blogs for a travel series for a local media company in Vancouver about the various stories of the cities of Rotterdam, Amsterdam, Utrecht, Eindhoven, and Groningen. But that spiraled out of control because there's so much to tell here. That led to the writing of the first book, Building the Cycling City, And with that, we both made connections that led to jobs here in the Netherlands. And so, yes, as you've mentioned, in 2019, after our book was published in 2018, 1 year later, we found ourselves here living in Delft, working for companies that were doing exactly what our book intended to do, communicating the ideas and policies and designs of Dutch cities to international cities, and helping them realize how they can transform into more cycling and walking friendly cities, using the Dutch model as inspiration to apply that in context. And then, yeah, within the first year of living here, we expected a lot of the quality of life changes that we did experience, but not to the scale that we did. And that's what led us to writing Curbing Traffic, is really communicating what it feels like to live in a low car city, and how important that is to so many people, and for us to export this idea as far as possible.
I mean, it's a really big deal, isn't it? Moving to a different country that doesn't even have your first language. How sure were you that this was going to be a good move for you?
I think for us, we were fairly certain it was going to be a good move. We knew the language was going to be, and continues to be, a struggle. Our children, fortunately, have been quite resilient and picked up the language a lot faster than mom and dad. And actually, this week I've started just another round of Dutch lessons to try to beef up my language skills. But I think we found ourselves in Vancouver at this point where we were ready to downsize. We'd been living in the city for 11 years, and we're just ready to have a slower pace. And, like many people, you want to move to a smaller town and just downsize a little bit in terms of the scale of life around you, as much as we love Vancouver. But where we found ourselves was unable to find a city in and around where we were living that could emulate the quality of life we enjoyed in Vancouver, where we could walk to our local shops, where we could bike to local amenities, to school, to work comfortably without having to fall backwards into that role where we would find ourselves again fighting for space on the road with cars, which is where we had started the journey back in 2007, 2008. So, by 2018, we were ready to not have to do that again. And being that we fell in love with this country when we were here, and our experiences here, and knowing that we could find a city like Delft with just 100,000 people where we could enjoy all those same aspects and quality of life that we did, it seemed the natural transition for us. So yeah, despite the language and the cultural barriers, because it's a completely different culture from our own as well in Canada. We've settled in nicely. We're still getting used to things, but I think, 2.5 years in, we're definitely certain that we've made the right move. But it was a big deal. It certainly was. And,
Yeah.
There's always that what if, but we're happy to report that so far, so good.
Yeah, I'm really pleased for you that has gone well. And you raise through that narrative quite an interesting thing that I felt from your book, was that your own personal experience and what you want as a family, and the culture and the society you live in, that is the thread in your Curbing Traffic book that I've just read. And it was kind of a surprise to me, because I kind of thought environment, curbing traffic, let's just get rid of the tailpipe. But actually, it's so much bigger than that. And you very much put in my mind that actually at the center of change isn't how do we get rid of the car, or how do we make the car more climate friendly. It's what do people, how do they thrive in an urban environment? Was that always your intention with the book, to come at it from a people perspective first and foremost? That's the way I interpreted it anyway.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's funny because you're the first person to have caught on to that in terms of the title or noted it anyways, as to what's in the book. But when Chris and I sat down and said, okay, I think this second story is really important for us to share, it was very much focused on how we felt as individuals, and how we watched, and how our children were feeling, how we perceived them to be feeling anyways, because you can only know so much how your kids are feeling. But those impacts of living in a place with fewer cars, that's what we really wanted to communicate. And we were very it was very important to us that we dug into the research of why that's important for our mental health and our physical health and our sociological health in terms of how we interact with each other. Yeah, that's first and foremost, we wanted this to be a book about the impact on human beings for low carb, because so often we do, as you pointed out, we talk about the benefits to the environment, we talk about the benefits to traffic safety, and sort of those external factors, but we so rarely talk about the internal factors for us as human beings. And I think for both of us, we're at a point now where yes, all of those other arguments are very valid for reducing combustion engines in our cities, or any motor vehicle for that matter. But the compelling argument now needs to be, how do we improve the life for every individual? Because for a lot of people, the climate crisis isn't enough, or traffic safety isn't enough. But if politicians and policymakers are really focused on making life better for people, then this is the case as to why.
And is that something within your work that you've been doing, in addition for your consultancy and for your day job? Is that a theme where you're trying to get people who are interested in changing their towns or cities, that actually the focus at the planning stage needs to be the person, rather than how do we deal with changing lanes in in the middle of a city? How does that work?
I think it's still a growing conversation. So, most planners and designers do focus on, how do we design lanes that are safer? How do we transform our street? But there are those of us within the industry that are pushing for this other conversation, and helping to communicate it to the non-technicians, because that's, at the end of the day, a lot of these people are the ones that make the decisions around cities, or people that don't necessarily understand the technical. But if you can give them the sociological reason as to why this is important, it helps them to understand better. So if you say, okay, well, if we reduce the lane from 3 meters down to 2.5 meters for a car, I don't know if that's more of a bike lane, but anyway, if you increase a bike lane from 1 meter to 2.5 meters, it has X, Y, Z benefits in terms of traffic safety. That means something for a technician or someone who's doing traffic modeling. But if you say to an everyday citizen or to a politician that's not a technician, if you increase this bike lane, you increase the capacity and the options for people for transport, which opens it up to a broader spectrum of people and not just those that can afford to drive. That's a different conversation. And so it's a growing one. I wouldn't say that it's one that we have every day, but it is one that I myself definitely try to keep having with people, and keep pushing that envelope a little bit further, to move beyond just the technical, to understand more. It's referred to as sort of software, but more of like the human impact.
Okay. Another thing that comes through is, and I don't know whether this is true or it's just how I've interpreted it, is that if you get the infrastructure right on transport in terms of space for walkers and bicycles and any other non-car way of getting from A to B, then you'll naturally lead to a reduction in cars. Is that true, or is but it seems from what you're, that's how I wondered whether that, if you focus on making it better for everybody else, then the natural tendency will be for less people using cars.
I certainly think it's a much more sort of nuanced argument,
Mm-hmm.
or case, but definitely it's when what we see in cities that are investing in cycling, not just in the Netherlands, but in Vancouver, for example, they invested a lot from 2008, and they continue to, but a bulk of that was 2008 to 2018. You saw that shift in how people moved because they had more options all of a sudden. So by improving the infrastructure or addressing the network so that there are other ways for people to get around and they're not solely reliant on getting around by a car, you do see that shift inherently, because people who do drive see another option. People who are tired of being stuck in traffic will look and see, oh, there's this bike lane right here where I could move much faster and I could get some exercise. I'm not going that far. This is a good option. There's just this inherent acknowledgement that suddenly there are more choices. And then as you see more people doing these activities, using cycling or walking to get around, or mixing that with public transport, then you see that shift start to happen as people recognize there is another choice. But it takes time. It takes investment. It's not a quick sort of snap and it's fixed. But it does. In that 10 years we were in Vancouver, we saw a definite modal shift in terms of how people got around Vancouver just as a result of the investments they were making in and around the city in cycling and walking.
And what is the dialogue about? In addition to that, is there a dialogue around reducing car use to those that are using it the most? Are there persuasive arguments to be had for those that have just automatically used the car as a way of getting to where they need to be? I say this with my own experience and having a bit more time just to walk in my own town when I have an errand to run. I would have some time ago just gone, well, I'll go in the car because I have a car. Why would I not go in the car? But obviously, going on this environmental journey, it's made me think about such things. But I've worked quite quickly into my own life about not taking the car as an automatic reflex. What sort of conversations are there about getting people out of their cars that persuade them that that's a pretty good choice to be had?
Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's any really good examples. I think most of it comes down to, I think of like bike to work weeks and things like that, where they communicate to people there is this other option and it becomes an attractive one, oftentimes people that are the ones that are driving. But what we found in the Netherlands in the research and sort of the transport patterns over the course of when they started this major investment in cycling in the early 70s till now, is a lot of it actually does come down to engineering, in that they make car travel the least efficient option for short trips, especially. So long distance trips, we still have ample motorways that are often filled with cars here that I don't want anyone to have any misgivings about
Yeah.
that. But going to the store to do your groceries is easier oftentimes if you do it by bike, because most networks are designed in a way that makes through traffic really inconvenient for cars. So you have, at a very basic level, you have a hierarchy of roads of your flow roads or your highways, your through roads, which would be like your arterials, and then your neighborhood streets. And getting around those neighborhood streets, it's very difficult to rat run. It's not comfortable. It's super inconvenient. It's more convenient to go all the way around. But if you have to go all the way around a neighborhood to get to the other side, then walking or cycling becomes the natural choice because it's faster, it's more efficient. So in that way, it's through engineering that they've helped to shift those trips from car travel to cycling and walking, by making walking and cycling the most logical choice in terms of people that just don't want to spend a lot of time moving around, trying to find parking, having to navigate through lights and what have you. So I think that's been the key to success here. And oftentimes it's the key to success when other cities are adapting this, is how do we make short trips under 5 kilometers much more convenient by cycling than by car. And then you see that inherent shift, because we're pragmatic people, or we're a pragmatic species. We do what makes sense, even if we're not like you and I helping to save the environment as well. Most people don't want to waste time. So making those trips easier, the more sustainable trips easier, is through engineering is one of the key factors.
And can you see that the way that it is set up in the Netherlands can be done pretty much anywhere? Are there things that would stop it being done elsewhere?
I would say absolutely, but I always say it with a caveat, it's not copy paste. So it's about taking the ideas from here and applying them in a way that makes sense in the UK, in France, in Canada, in the US, in New Zealand, because as most people will argue, and they're absolutely right, the street networks are different, but it doesn't mean that they can't be adapted in a way to bring more of that model in. So I think of the suburbs where my parents live, just south of Toronto in Canada, and there's absolutely a way to adapt those to make them more convenient for walking and cycling, to reduce unnecessary car trips, by applying traffic calming, which can be as simple as putting like reducing speeds first and foremost on neighborhood streets, putting out planters, putting in diverters, so it helps to reduce rat running or people racing from one place to another and using a side street to do so. It's relatively easy in these cauliflower sort of neighborhoods that have been designed in most suburbs to apply that traffic calming, and then also thinking beyond that, how do we plan these neighborhoods, making sure that amenities are thought of as we're designing new neighborhoods, making sure that there is shopping, there are services nearby that are walkable and cyclable to get to. I mean, it's a much bigger, it's such a big idea, but that we do see it. And that's the first book we wrote, Building the Cycling City, really looks at that, is looks at cities in Canada and the US that are taking these ideas and applying them on their local streets in a sort of made for them way. So a made in Portland or made in Calgary kind of way. So it's absolutely possible. And there's lots of inspiration to be had. We often say they've made all the mistakes here, so now everywhere else can just learn from them and do something even better.
Well, and there's the thing, isn't it? The fact that we're in a world where we can communicate to anyone and everyone. There's no point in reinventing the wheel if we found a solution that's going to work somewhere. Let's just transport it, pardon the pun, to other places. I'm wondering whether, because of the current climate emergency, where transport is coming under quite a lot of scrutiny, understandably, because of the fossil fuel impact on climate change, whether now is actually a really useful time to be sharing that information, because if changes are going to be made to try to reduce numbers of people in cars as well as converting them to electric, whether the appetite for hearing about how to change the transport within cities is now higher. Are you finding that that's the case?
I certainly see that the case within urban transport professionals and within the urban planning sort of circles. Is that's the conversation that's happening, is very much focused on, okay, now it's time, we need to do something. I think what's been the unfortunate benefit of unfortunate benefit's the wrong way of saying that, but with COVID, it's actually pushed that conversation further faster, but not because of the climate crisis, unfortunately, but because people needed to find new transport options. But I think that's helped to bolster the conversation forward in terms of how do we create safer streets for walking and cycling, but then how do we facilitate walking and cycling as a transport option, because public transport, people are nervous about it, but we can't have everyone get in a car because of, well, the climate crisis, but also our streets just don't have the capacity. And so that's helped to push it forward. And I certainly know that, when it comes to looking at more sustainable options, I mean, I work for an organization, obviously, that focuses on that. So I hear that conversation a lot. But more and more cities are thinking, how do we address this? How do we provide more options to try to make that shift? And at the same time, those people that are thinking a little bit further ahead are also thinking, yes, electric cars help to solve some of the problems around the climate crisis, but they don't necessarily solve all of the problems in terms of materials and manufacturing and battery life and street damage from a heavier vehicle, but also just in terms of congestion, they're not going to solve that problem. And so people are now starting to think more innovatively. How do we come up with new vehicles? How do we address this? And, we see the explosion of cargo bikes happening in a lot of cities as a new family transport option, as a new logistics option that are much less damaging on the environment. And, when we're talking about specifically for logistics, deliveries within city centers, oftentimes those really big lorries are not required to do the deliveries that are needed. So these are becoming more, especially here, but elsewhere as well, in other countries. We're seeing more and more of these greener logistics options coming up. So I'm excited. I hope that this is a continuing trend that will carry on more and more, because obviously everyone has a personal investment in what the future holds. But as a mother, I want to make sure that I'm doing my utmost for my kids to say, I tried, I did my absolute best.
For sure. I'd like to just come back to you've had that whole lived experience. Not only have you been motivated because of your work, but the fact that you've had these two experiences of living in different places, and now where you are in Delft, that's a new environment where you can walk and cycle and you don't have a car at all. It's an interesting story to hear. How has it been? And did it meet your expectation in terms of what it would actually be like living without a car?
Yeah, so we found ourselves living completely car free, whereas we'd been car light up until this point. And I think, there's always a bit of worry because, there were certain trips that we needed to rely on to have a car for in Canada. That the same would be true here. We weren't sure where we would find ourselves, but we were actually quite pleased at the number of trips that we could still make by bicycle or by a mixture of bikes and public transport to get to where we needed to. The most notable was last summer, our son went to a summer camp in the north of the country. And there is normally a bus that picks the kids up and takes them there. But because of Corona, unfortunately, that didn't happen last year. And we found ourselves sort of wondering, how do we get him there? And through a combination of the train from Delft to a nearby station and the OV feats, or the public bike share through the train stations, we were able to cycle with him a fair distance to his camp. But that whole way, all of the route was easy to navigate. There were cycle paths through all of the rural countryside to get us there. And then we could come back ourselves, take the train home. And, through a little bit of extra work, we managed to get him there without having to have a car. And so I think, for us, that's a bit of an extreme case. I think for a lot of Dutch people, they probably think we're a little cuckoo for doing it. But for us, it sort of proved that there was an option. We didn't have to have a car to get everywhere. So it's been a nice revelation. It's obviously less of a financial burden on our part,
Sure.
having to worry about owning and storing one. But yeah, certainly, it's been a positive experience for us at least. And I'm glad to know that, we live in a place that allows us to live this way quite comfortably.
Yeah, and sort of on that theme, you mentioned in your book that you're obviously being able to embrace the fact that you don't have a car, but also that those perhaps that actually a car is more problematic for and is less accessible can still get around quite easily without one. Can you tell us a little bit more about how actually the fact that the system is set up in the way that it is actually makes it more accessible to a greater range of people?
Yeah. So in the book, we tell the story of Maya, who is a friend of ours, living here in Delft, who is living with multiple sclerosis. So she's been on a slow, sort of downward grade in terms of her physical ability to get around on with her own body. And so, at a certain point, she has had to start relying on using a mobility scooter to get around. And we see lots of people getting around with mobility scooters or on adaptive cycles here. And before we interviewed her, we're like, oh, of course it's accessible. We see it happening. But listening to her, she really opened our eyes to how important these traffic calm streets are in terms of ensuring that she doesn't have to rely on the quality of a sidewalk to get around.
Mhm.
She can just use the street to get around comfortably. But even more so, she is studying in Den Haag, just about a half an hour bike ride from where we are. And the infrastructure the way it is, and the traffic calming, and the cycle tracks being the way they are, she can use the battery power in her scootmobile to get her from Delft all the way to Den Haag for her lessons without having to rely on someone to drive her there, or having to hire a taxi or an adaptive taxi to get her there, or even having to go through what can be a quite burdensome experience of coordinating with the public transport to get her on a train and where she needs to go. So it's really liberating for her and for individuals like her who are maybe less mobile physically, but have these tools to be
Mm.
able to use them to empower themselves to get to where they need to go. She really points out, I don't want to be dependent on others to experience the city, to be able to do what I need to do. And the way it's been designed here really enables that for her.
Yeah, and I think it's so important, isn't it, to allow everybody to have that sort of independence and accessibility to the things that we all, those that are able bodies or that are in a more economic financial position can make choices quite easily, whereas others can't. And to be able to give everyone options about getting employment, as and getting about is really quite
Hmm.
crucial. And I think those are things that I hadn't thought about until until I read the book. So I would
Yeah.
definitely encourage others to look at it. It's such an inclusive book, actually, because it covers so many different types of people. Well, it just covers everyone. You go right from children to old age and everyone in between. What are you hoping? Because I know you're great advocates, you and Chris, about storytelling, and I'm a real fan of getting points across with a story. What do you hope to achieve by this kind of storytelling?
I think our number one goal has always been to help to humanize these stories for people. I think I know a lot of times the conversations focus so heavily on mode share or on expenses or on the data, which is important in terms of making a compelling case for why cities should invest in these
Mm,
things. But oftentimes the misunderstanding beyond that is, well, I don't understand how this impacts me. I don't understand, why this is important. And by humanizing the benefits of sustainable mobility and through the storytelling, I think it helps to get people to understand better what it is we're all trying to achieve. It's not just about making everyone, a capital C cyclist, for example,
yeah.
or turning everyone into an environmentalist. It's about really making sure that, as you said, anyone, from childhood to old age, ability to non-ability, economic prosperity to economic strife, has opportunities to move around their city independently, comfortably, safely, and happily. And so that's why storytelling for us is just so important. It's not about the mode, it's not about the tool, it's about the people who use them to get around.
Yeah. And you're very careful to talk about not boxing people and saying, oh, that's a cyclist and that's a car driver. Can you explain why you've just made sort of that conscious decision not to pigeonhole people?
Oh, yeah, it's a very easy answer. um, what part of what inspired Chris and I to get started is that what we saw in the media was we, as people that used bikes to get around, were referred to as cyclists, and we were in a battle or at war with motorists or with drivers, but we were also drivers. So it didn't make sense to us that we've pigeonholed people by their modes, whether they're a pedestrian or a cyclist or a motorist, and then we pit each other against each other, and it's just not conducive. It's not helpful to any arguments. And so we have made a really concerted effort wherever possible to remove those labels where it makes sense. um,
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just, yeah, today I'm a cyclist, that's just how it is. But by removing those labels and referring to people as a person on a bike or a person pushing a stroller or a child doing this, it comes back to that idea again of really humanizing people. And yeah, labels in general tend to not help us in any discourse, whether it's transport or otherwise. So yeah, bringing it back to the individual is the main reason why we did that.
Yeah, that sounds eminently sensible for sure. Where do you hope to go with this ongoing conversation? What do you think will be next for the two of you?
That's a great question. I think we're both right now really focused. We've now written this book, and we'll continue to do the promotion, but we want to really put our efforts into our professions and really help the organizations that we work with to really keep pushing this conversation forward of the benefits of a human powered travel.
Mm.
And for my part, I see, at least for myself, a continuation in sort of the focusing a lot on the equity of it. And so how do we get more women involved? How do we make sure that more people with limited mobility are involved in the conversation? How do we bring more diversity into urban planning? Because it was a theme that came up again and again in the book. Is part of the reason that we don't build our cities for everyone yet is because everyone's not a part of the conversation. And so that's, for me, that's really important, is we start to see that shift in the industry, so we can start seeing that shift on the streets as well in terms of who has access to as many transport options as possible.
Yeah, and you talk about everybody being involved in the conversation. How do you get Because obviously everyone is involved in this conversation to a greater or lesser degree. How do you get that sort of dialogue going at every sort of level?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. It's not an easy question. One of the things, well, there's several things, but one of the first places to start, if you work in the transport industry, is to look around you. Who are you working with? If you're involved in the hiring decisions, are you hiring people that just look like you? Or are you taking into account the experience of people that don't look like you and bringing them into your organization, or giving them opportunities to be involved in these decisions and planning that happen? The same goes for leadership at various levels, whether that's, our politicians. Are we seeing diversity in our politicians? If not, then something needs to change. And whether that is supporting someone, supporting women, supporting people of color in their runs for political bids, or whether it's supporting community organizations that are more diverse, that's certainly a place to start. And then at the very, grassroots level of it, when we're doing engagement, when we're having these conversations about neighborhood plans with communities, making sure that that engagement is being brought to the groups that you're trying to represent. So, just going to the community center next to City Hall is probably not going to get a diverse group of people to come out and be part of the conversation. But if you go to the neighborhoods where there is more people of color or more people of different backgrounds, if you go to community centers where women are, doing, having children's activities and talking to the women there, bringing the engagement to them is one of the first steps people can take to really start to get a more broad idea of what it is people want. Because unfortunately, up until this point, most engagement unfortunately happens when those groups can't attend because they're working part-time, or they're minding children, or they're busy getting dinner ready for their families, or any other number of things. So really taking into account, how do we reach the people we want to be involved in this conversation, and then how do we bring this conversation to them instead of asking them always to come to us.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting, good point. Well made. Drawing to a close, I've got two last questions for you, Melissa. The first of which is, for somebody that's listening to this podcast episode, what would be your recommendation to them about transport?
Oh, that's such a broad question.
Yes, it is. I realise. You can say anything.
I can go anywhere. I would say it's a message I think I've been saying to people interested in cycling for a long time, that if you're interested in cycling but you're nervous or you're curious, find local groups that you can join, that you can just experience cycling, or just give it a try. Start small. Bike to work weeks are a great entry point for a lot of people, but for many people it's a trip too far. So just bike to the local store, bike to a friend's house. If you want to take up cycling as a sustainable transport option, that's probably one of the easiest ways to get started. Or just try switching some of your trips from getting in your car to try walking instead. And there's as we pointed in the book, there's so many benefits to that at a very human level that you can gain. Yeah, and then for those of us, and for those other of us that are working in transport or working to improve transport, we need to stop settling. We need to push past and not settle for the status quo. We really need to keep pushing that envelope, because what we're seeing more and more is the appetite is out there. People want this. Unfortunately, we hear from the vocal minority more often than not, in terms of people that don't want to see their streets change. But what is found time and time again is when we make even small investments in changing from car-based systems to more sustainable options, people adapt, people are happier, and they welcome the change. So be bold, be brave, and just push forward.
That's great advice. You're effectively saying start from where you're at, and be brave, which is cool. And then finally, how do you see sustainable transport being in 2050, or how do you hope to see it in 2050?
I really hope that we don't undervalue the importance of the simple modes of transport. I see so many conversations around high tech solutions, and I think we have a lot of the solutions. We have the ability to walk or roll through our cities, or cycle through your city. So I my hope, my vision for the future is one that's greener in terms of the landscape, more nature, but also more people choosing walking or human powered movement to get around their city. That's what I hope. Anyways, I hope for lively public spaces and lots of people being able to interact with each other on a very human level.
Well, that's a really nice picture to end on. Lots of people gathering together, smiling at each other, having good interactions. So, thank you so
Yeah.
much, Melissa. It's been great to have you on and hear all we have to share about this really fascinating subject. So, thanks.
Oh, thanks, Carolyn, so much for having me. It's been fun.
Well, what a great episode to end this first podcast series. We can all relate to modes of travel to get us from one place to another, whether it be on foot, cycling, using public transport, or in a car. I think the way in which Melissa and Chris have put people at the centre of their narrative for sustainable transport is hugely powerful and persuasive, and I can highly recommend reading their latest book, Curbing Traffic. I'd like to thank Andy Shaw for audio editing, Jeremy Jones for providing the music, and you for listening. I have been grateful to my 9 guests on this first series for sharing their environmental stories, and I've learned such a great deal whilst thoroughly enjoying chatting to them. If you want to hear more stories of people doing great things that positively impact our environment, there will be more episodes starting in September. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and if so, please do rate and review the podcast. It would be a great help. Thanks. Until next time, bye for now.